Glyphosate is a major issue, and for good reason. Kelly Ryerson, also known as the Glyphosate Girl, comes on the podcast to explain a lot more about the science and the problems with it. Her health journey was the catalyst for all of her work, and it's a very, very enlightening conversation. Kelly, thank you for joining an extremely important topic. I think that you know that as much as anybody, but as the Glyphosate Girl, give us that background. How in the world did you get into learning about a herbicide, poison, however we want to classify it?
This is not something I ever thought about for most of my life, or for the first half of my life, I should say. I didn't really think about food and how it's produced one way or the other. And after I had two kids, after I had my second child, my health really just started failing. And it wasn't even something that was so specific where you could say, well, I was diagnosed with this or this. It was like an overall systemic kind of decline where I was having things like rashes and anxiety and depression, like to too much of a degree, and digestive problems, losing some hair. I was weak in my legs and kind of was losing my ability to walk, and my eyesight was going. So there were just a lot of things going on. And I was practically living in my doctor's office. And, when you come with so many different things, different ailments that seem unconnected, and there's so many different body systems, it's very easy for today's doctor to look and be like, well, you are a hypochondriac. There's no way. Those are different systems. Like, a lot of Western doctors don't think of how everything might be connected. And that is what I ran into. So following that, I was sent to about 20 different specialists for all these different problems, that I had. And I was put on 2 antidepressants because I must be crazy. And I was put on benzodiazepine, steroid, gabapentin. I was a pharmacy, and I had all these drugs had side effects. It was just terrible. So it was a very low point in my life. And finally I was like, I need to go see a psychiatrist, because maybe I'm imagining it, because this is what the tests are showing me. So I go and see a psychiatrist. He happens to have intake blood work that had vitamin levels tested, and I'd never tested for them. And so they came back totally depleted, like third world person. And I was like, well, maybe this has something to do with it. Now, the Western doctors said, no, vitamins don't really matter. And that was a big clue to me. I'm like, no, I'm pretty sure that they are absolutely fundamental to our biology. And so I started supplementing that, but it didn't knock everything out of the park. And then I saw a new doctor who said, I think you should try giving up gluten. So she said a lot of her patients, particularly female patients and kids, are having a lot of success getting rid of random seeming symptoms by giving up gluten. So went off of gluten. Several weeks later, I started to rapidly improve. Inflammation was coming down, could taper off of drugs. It was miraculous. And so I went to the Columbia University, had a conference for celiac and for non-celiac gluten sensitivity for doctors and scientists. And I was like, I want to go and I'm neither. I was like, I'm going to go and learn about this from the people that are studying it and figure out what this non-celiac gluten sensitivity is. So I went, and long and short of it is they don't know what it is, but I did go up to the microphone and I asked, is something different with the grain? Is anything being sprayed on it? No one knew. And then a head scientist from General Mills found me, pulled me aside and said, yeah, so Roundup is sprayed on the grains just before harvest. And I was like, Roundup, the weed killer? He said, yeah. And I was like, well, don't you think that has something to do with our growing food intolerance? And he said, well, I don't know, but it's going to take 2 decades to get farmers to change their practices. And I was like, oh no. So what I did was I started reading like crazy about glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup. And it was so sweet. Dr. Stephanie Seneff was the first person I met with. I happened to be in Boston at the time, and she's like, come over. So I went to MIT, we sat down, and she just gave me the whole huge overview of what was going on. And I mean, it was overwhelming. Like, oh my gosh, this is a huge, huge nut to crack. And around that time too, the cancer Roundup trials were starting in San Francisco. So this was 2018. And I live just south of San Francisco. And so I was like, well, I'm going to go up and check this out, because I'm so mad at Monsanto. I'm so mad at this. And it was the first time that Monsanto had ever been put to trial in front of a jury. So it was like this huge deal. So I went up there thinking that there would be masses of people that are, would protest Monsanto, because that just seems like a thing that you see happen. And there was no one there. I walked straight in, sat down with the attorneys, and there was like one other person from media sitting there. And I was like, how come no one's talking about this? And of course, now, from my perspective now, of course, it was kept as quiet as possible. So I quit my job and I decided to name myself Glyphosate Girl, and I started blogging every single session in 3 different court cases in San Francisco, to be sure that everyone could read and see just how corrupt the EPA was in continuing to approve this chemical. So that is what I've been focusing on now for years, just specifically glyphosate, but also the health impacts of pesticides and how we can potentially resolve it through regenerative farming.
Wow. So let's just dive in a little bit into that aspect. So of the gluten, I'm curious to kind of break that down before we dive more into the glyphosate, because do you feel that maybe the problem isn't as much gluten as it is the potential for glyphosate? And is that mean that organic might possibly avoid some of those problems? How have you come to think about that topic?
So I've gone back and forth over the years, depending on which specialists I've talked to, because there's an idea that glyphosate is so incredibly disruptive to the microbiome that it makes it even harder to tolerate the inflammatory aspect of gluten, because it's an inflammatory protein anyway, the gliadin protein that's in gluten. And so that it's inflammatory in and of itself. There's also the fact that we don't process grains in the way we used to historically, because now it's very rapid processing. And so a lot of the inflammatory components of gluten remain when we're eating them, particularly in the United States. So there's that as well. But then there's also data and research that shows that if you're having them together, it's sort of like, a double blow. So there's some people that can't have non-organic gluten. I mean, they can't have non-organic bread. They can have organic bread made with wheat and they're fine. There are others like me that still struggle, however, when I'm in Europe, where they don't do that pre-harvest spraying and they do a longer process for processing bread products, then I don't have that same inflammatory reaction, which is true for a lot of people that don't tolerate gluten. So it's very interesting. I think the underlying thing is realizing that it's 80% of our dietary exposure is through this process of pre-harvest desiccation. So whether it's grain or if it's chickpeas or sugarcane, there are a lot of different crops that are sprayed just before harvest, and they just have these massive levels that our body wasn't designed to consume. So in other words, I don't think it's a clear-cut answer. I just know it's adding to the problem.
Well, yeah, that makes sense, and I did not know that about chickpeas and sugarcane. So that's super interesting.
Yeah, hummus is one of
What
the worst things you can buy that's not organic.
what is
Hummus.
hummus? Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
crazily how much that is consumed. So for me, I'm super sensitive to gluten. Right, that has been my belief. But sourdough, especially the real or long form fermentation, doesn't bother me at all. But like if I had like just a regular croissant, I would be in the fetal position. It'd be terrible. So I'm curious as that plays out, and maybe it doesn't really even matter. But the glyphosate versus gluten argument, maybe it is just simply it's both, right? And that's I've seen a meme recently about it's not the gluten, it's the glyphosate. Like it circles around social media from time to time, and that just had me really questioning it. But I know how I feel when I eat it, and the gluten is something that I at least pay attention to.
Hmm.
Kelly, let's talk about glyphosate then on what it does at that fundamental level. What is the problem? Why is it an issue for us to have it in or around us?
And it is the most widely used herbicide in the history of the world. I mean, just so much of this is used. So even we're eating it, it's in the air, it's in the rain, it's, I've done lab tests, it's in hair, it's in urine, it's in my daughter's baby tooth, it's in semen. It is really just throughout our body. So we are now walking as, you know, just completely filled with this toxin. And there are thousands and thousands of pages of research about the damaging health effects. They're so far ranging that it's interesting because so many people have these systemic effects that are really inflammatory. And, but it's hard to trace it to something that is invisible. So this is what I'm dealing with all the time, is trying, and clearly you too, by having a podcast like this, is trying to take this invisible chemical that is so powerful and bring it to people's awareness. Because if you don't see it, you don't think about it. You just know that you're not feeling great. And it takes a long time for it to do its effects too. But I'm talking about things as wide ranging as it contributing to infertility. It contributes to ADHD. It contributes to liver disease, kidney disease, cancer, anxiety, depression. It messes with hormones to such an effect that pregnant women, when they consume food that has high levels of glyphosate in it, it's now been traced to having a changed anatomy of female fetuses, where the anus and the vagina becomes farther apart because it's like it's causing an androgenic type of effect. And so it crosses the blood-brain barrier, contributing to neurological problems. So there really isn't much. In fact, sometimes when I think of a condition, I go to PubMed and I see, I wonder, and it just glyphosate is attached to so many of these things. And what really drives me crazy is in my own diagnosis, I know like every week a friend of a friend will get in touch with me and say, I have an autoimmune condition now. What do you think? I mean, this is happening all over the place. Autoimmunity is spreading so rapidly, and people just immediately jump on to hardcore pharmaceuticals to treat it, which is a shame because, that it also has its own taxing thing. There are lots of people that are also able to reverse the condition by changing what they're eating, which is phenomenal. But, and that is where that aspect of leaky gut comes into play, which I'm sure you guys have talked about, where toxins get from inside of the gut into the bloodstream where they're not supposed to be because of this malfunctioning basically of tight junctions in the gut. So lots of things that shouldn't be there go into the bloodstream, your body reacts, and suddenly you're autoimmune. And for me, I actually did have autoimmune markers. It wasn't a specific autoimmune condition. And there's some scientists I've talked to now that there's so many different varieties now of autoimmune conditions that most don't even have a name, because they're showing up as different things. And it's just an overall state of autoimmunity. And I think a lot of us are walking around like that. Another big problem with glyphosate is it was originally developed actually for use as a pharmaceutical, but none of the chemists could find actual use for it in pharmaceutical purposes. So instead, then it started becoming used as a metal pipe cleaner. And because of its ability to bind to minerals and very, very effectively. So now what you have is this is all over our soil, and it just so penetrating it, and it lasts for years. And it also binds to the minerals in the soil. So now once it's bound to these minerals, they're completely biounavailable for the crops to take up. So that means that we don't get those key minerals that our bodies need, and we're walking around constantly deficient in them. And I just look around at how angry everyone is, and so stressed, and the use of antidepressants is so high. And I'm like, if people just had like magnesium and zinc just to start, I think that you would see the temperament of the country and the world just calm down a little bit.
Absolutely. The chelation aspect might be one of the most problematic issues with it. If Morley Robbins has been on a couple times, but just talking about the importance of, say, magnesium and copper. I mean, zinc's definitely there too. It is mind-blowing how many functions within the body that they are responsible for being a cofactor at a minimum, right? And so what did you see when you were super deficient across the board on kind of overcoming the mineral aspects, those mineral and vitamin aspects of being depleted based off of, what sounds like a really high glyphosate load?
Yeah. And, one of the first things I did was come home from a doctor's appointment and filled my bathtub with Epsom salts and got in. And it's not something I had ever done before, actually, a magnesium bath. And and I hadn't been able to sleep in so long. Like it just, my ability to sleep had gone. And I had that first magnesium bath and I went and I had the longest nap and it was so blissful. And I'm like, huh, I mean, is that why everyone needs a sleeping pill? Right. I mean, and this was so wild. And so then I got the book, The Magnesium Miracle, and just started reading. Like, wow, this is so fundamental. But what was happening to me is I think when you're deficient across the board, it's really hard to add certain vitamins and not have it react because there's so many cofactors. So I would add something that's relatively benign. This isn't the case with magnesium, but with some of the B vitamins, I would add something and then it would set off the deficiency in something else. So I'd get a really bad side effect from it. So I ended up studying some cell biology through an extension course to just try and learn how do you rebuild a cell. Because at the time, and this is only a few years ago, there was much less information out publicly, except for a few books about mineral deficiency and vitamin deficiency, because I think it just wasn't as rampant or as well known. And so I was talking to different scientists. I would call like the B1 specialist and like the D specialist. And I'm like, this is what's happening right now to me. What do you think I need to add? So I was such a guinea pig. And I mean, it was really an experience, but the people that can master rebuilding and understanding different biologies to rebuild, I mean, those are some amazing people because it's really complicated actually. But yeah, adding back those things just, it's so blissful, you know. And I had added D at first at high levels and didn't realize you need magnesium also. And so then I had like horrible like sound sensitivity and light sensitivity. I'm like, oh my gosh, okay, it's a magnesium. You know, it's a balance.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. I messed my so the MTHFR gene variation kind of went down that rabbit trail and just trying to fix myself with B vitamins and folic acid being poison and needing a methylated
Yeah.
form of folate and all this, right? And so I took so much I got to hypermethylating, and that is
Oh my
it's terrible. Like I hit a super deep depression. It was literally one of the darkest little periods, and it was because I was taking B vitamins at high doses. And so it is something that we've got to be so careful of. And then, on that methylation side, Dr. Sneff goes into the autism, right? And talking about, say, sulfur and the methylation pathways and how intricate those are. But one thing that she, in relation to that, brought up the hypothesis that glyphosate displaces glycine amino acids to disrupt the proteins. I find that absolutely fascinating, and I'm not sure why that's not being screamed from the rooftops as a problem with glyphosate. Because if she's right, if that is accurate, that very well could be another smoking gun.
Oh, it should be such a huge because something has to account for the fact that it bioaccumulates. And you'll hear a lot of people say it doesn't bioaccumulate. That's crazy. Well, you can test anything. Like, it, it totally bioaccumulates. I don't even understand that argument. So what is the method in which it does that? And it's interesting with the glycine thing because I mean, Dr. Sanif is so brilliant that I'm like, well, that is probable that that's happening. I just think because I trust her. And but there have been some scientists that have fought her on that, and so that it became a contentious thing. But a lot of academics will do that. And so, I mean, it's a brutal world out there in academia, according to what I'm seeing. But I agree, and I think the person that could fund the test to see if that is the case, I mean, that should be really huge. Because if it's not that, what is it? How are we bioaccumulating? I mean, and you're so right about the just going back to your experience with. So I was a MTHFR double like homozygous bad situation, and so I was like, great, I'm going to have all this B12 methylated. Oh my gosh, that is hell. It's so awful. And so I was like, I'm never going to do that again. Now I just try and get everything from food.
I I know, and the big thing that got my attention and why I super pulled back was that that adversity, that dark period. And so when you go back into the MTHFR, and I'm homozygous on one SNP and the heterozygous on another, but what Morley says, are you familiar with Morley Robbins?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. I was gonna say, if y'all aren't, I have to connect y'all because I think his work is right up there with anybody's. But the copper aspect with the MTHFR is mind blowing how important that is. So once I started trying to get the minerals right, especially copper, I sleep better. The MTHFR, symptoms, which they are crazy how broad those are too.
Oh my
When you're
gosh.
not methylating properly,
Yeah.
most everything has lined out with the combination of getting minerals right and getting, the diet and the light. There's a lot of, like the quantum side of light, water, magnetism, things that, that matter maybe even more. But where, where are you on the glyphosate as an antibiotic on the gut microbiome, because that's
Oh,
another aspect that, the minerals are just like that may be the foundation for me, like get the minerals right, what in the deep
yeah.
dive that means, but the microbiome is right up there too, especially as you had mentioned, anxiety, depression, that the gut brain connection is crucial. So go through that glyphosate and the microbiome.
Yeah. So glyphosate ended up actually being patented by Monsanto as antimicrobial. And what is so surprising about this type of antimicrobial is that it specifically impacts our beneficial gut bacteria, but allows the bad stuff to proliferate. So it only impacts the stuff we really like depend on, for all that good mood stuff that you're talking about. And many different studies have been done on glyphosate's impact on the microbiome. It definitely kills this really key bacteria, which has something called the shikimate pathway, which is the energy source for the bacteria, which originally the reason why Monsanto could claim that glyphosate and Roundup only impact nature is because humans don't have that shikimate pathway. But of course, that was well before anyone realized just how vital or even the existence of the microbiome and how it's connected to all of our different um, everything that happens basically in our body is somewhat connected to the microbiome. And then we're having this thing that specifically kills off the this entirely very, very critical pathway to getting things like serotonin. Um, and that is, once again, it's like when you line up all the effects of what glyphosate does, it's like, which is worse? I mean, I really don't know. And it just leads me to just be fascinated by the fact that the EPA could continue to say that this has no impact on human health. And one of the things that I've been working on, and I'm on the board of Moms Across America. And what's great about that organization is they do a lot of testing of different foods to see what the content is of glyphosate and sometimes other pesticides too. So we put together various panels and we visited now the EPA 2 times. We went to the USDA and the FDA just a few months ago and we did a congressional briefing. And this was based on just how toxic children's school lunches and fast foods were. And the visits to the EPA actually were glyphosate specific. And I'll just tell you that we brought scientists and physicians with us to present what the evidence, the scientific evidence that we see of all these different harms, including the microbiome. And after a long, dare I say, gorgeous and very professional and fantastic presentation to the Office of Pesticide Programs in Northern Virginia, they said, what you're telling us is just anecdotal. And we were just dumbfounded. So we're like, there's nothing anecdotal. This is peer reviewed independent research from real scientists. And we're showing you so much. It's not one study. And then finally someone said, if you really want to have change, you're going to have to change who's over on Capitol Hill. And so we were like, I mean, that's clear. Nothing, they're not going to do their job. So, and in fact, going back to glyphosate's impact on cancer, something really phenomenal happened with that, where when the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, determined in 2015 that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen, there was a lot of pressure then put on the EPA to reevaluate whether or not glyphosate's a carcinogen. So what the EPA will do in these cases is they'll call in a scientific advisory panel of different experts that are presumably somewhat unbiased from different universities to come in, look at the research with fresh eyes and determine whether or not it's a carcinogen. And so one of the people that came is my friend, Dr. Luoping Zhang, who is just a global preeminent toxicologist at Cal. And she went and she looked at the evidence and she said, oh, this is highly linked to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so she and her colleagues determined that. And they told the EPA, and the EPA came out then with their result. They said, there's no evidence that this is a carcinogen. So she left that and she went with her colleagues that had also been on that panel, and they published this paper to show all the evidence that it is causing cancer. And what's especially terrifying is now the lawsuits against Bayer, who now owns Monsanto, are so monumental that it's basically bankrupting the company. They're still refusing to take it off of the market, even though every single day that it's sold, it's going to be more plaintiffs that are saying this caused cancer. And now they've been hiding behind, Bayer's been hiding behind the EPA very successfully. And to the point that California does not get this causes cancer sticker, even though the state believes that it does, because Bayer has been in lawsuits with California saying it goes against our right to free speech for you to make us label our product. And the EPA says that it doesn't cause cancer, so we don't have to. So now they're trying to, there's legislation now in Idaho and in Iowa where they're trying to take the rights away of anyone that gets sick from pesticide exposure, so that you are not allowed to sue the chemical company. That is now what they're trying to do to halt all the lawsuits, just take the rights away of people to sue the chemical manufacturers. So it's sick. It is so sick. And you think about like a place like Iowa, where every single day these farmers are using these tools. It's like the only recourse they'd have. And it's just a new ethical low to me to allow that kind of poisoning.
One thing I'm super curious about is like every product I think that I've ever seen has something from California that this causes cancer. Like literally everything. So why in the world would that not be on glyphosate?
Isn't that just amazing? In fact, I was at a Common Ground, the film screening in Sacramento, and I met Jennifer Newsom, who actually has been a big proponent of regenerative agriculture. And she said, well, isn't that banned? I thought that we put a label on that. I was like, oh no, it's like perpetually ongoing in the state of California, that legal battle about labeling it. It is the only thing that we have put on the Prop 65 list, which is known to the state of California to cause cancer, that hasn't then been labeled. I mean, it's so maddening
It's
and
crazy.
just so sad.
I feel like I've seen
And
it
they
on
and
like
Bayer had
even I feel like I've seen it on like turmeric and stuff. Like seriously, like things that like it has blown my mind what I've seen that with Prop 65 label. Uh any
I know. Well, I was walking by a place yesterday. I can't remember what was going on inside of the place. Maybe it was just like a beauty parlor, probably like a hair studio. And there was a big sign on the door: products used inside of here have been known to cause cancer, you know? And I was like, oh, wow. I mean, even to have that on the side of your cool salon is very sad.
Oh, the hypocrisy. Okay, so
Yes.
let's go through. Let's give some like kind of a hit list on what is the most important things that we either avoid or limit or source. And organic. I've got my feelings about organic, but it's better than I guess any other option that we have. What can we help use to steer away from the glyphosate exposures by limiting or avoiding or say go organic?
So first and foremost, like you say, I mean, I have my issues with organic too, because there are organic pesticides that are used in the process, but they're not glyphosate. So what I do in for my family is I do buy everything as organic as possible. I go to our local farmers market and talk to the farmers and try and assess in the cases where they're not certified organic, are they using pesticides? And usually they're pretty honest about it. Like, maybe they use it just very, very minimally. So it's just good information to have. I really tend to stay away. If I can't eat organically, then I'll tend to stay away from things that I mentioned that have been pre-harvest sprayed. So oats, it can be gluten-free, but if they're sprayed, that's not a good thing. So I just won't get that oat product unless it's organic. Same with hummus, as I was mentioning, because that is just loaded. I don't drink non-organic wine. So that's another area to avoid. So really thinking through what items might have been pre-harvest sprayed is one of the best things that you can do. In terms of other exposures, I have a water filter on my house water. I live in suburbia. We don't have a well. So I'm doing it that way to make sure I get that and, of course, a lot of the pharmaceuticals out of my drinking water. I also I have two dogs that I love dearly, and a lot of my neighbors still spray Roundup, and they know how I feel about it because I have my own home garden in the front, my front yard of suburbia, and I even have like it totally embarrassed my kids, by the way, but I have this this thing. It's like no pesticides, like they think that is the label, and it is. Like I feel embarrassed for them, but I just want them to know, and so but my neighbors across the street, there they are out on the sidewalk where like I see kids run by with bare feet, spraying Roundup, and not only kids, but dogs. And, dogs, in some of the studies that were done actually for these Roundup trials, were looking at animals to see where the absorption points are to absorb because the surfactant in Roundup penetrates through the skin and then it'll let the glyphosate in. And their little paws are so subjected to that when you think of taking them for walks. So I intentionally walk them not on the areas that I know have been sprayed. Lymphoma now is just sky high. Like it's insanity. Like so many dogs and cats get lymphoma. And I'm like, well, I mean, it's sprayed all over. So not too surprising. So I do that. And then I take off shoes in the house because for that same reason, I just don't want it around if kids are on the floor or dogs are on the floor, if I've tracked it in. So those are the primary ways that I work to avoid it.
Let's go back just a little bit on the pre-spray before harvest. Can you go into that process, what that means, and what are kind of our top offenders? Do you have like a top offender list?
Yeah. So what that is farmers got into the practice. Actually, the practice started in Scotland, like I think in the 1990s. That farmers found it much, much easier to harvest grains or whatever it is if it's dried out all at the same time. And then they can just do one pass their combine and they can do all their harvesting at once. So that does sound ideal if it was non-toxic, but we of course know that it is toxic. But then it goes directly to the mill and then it's put into your food and then you eat it. So it's a very direct line from this massive spraying to dry it out right to your dinner plate or your snack items. And the biggest ones that I think of are oats and wheat. Certainly, both of those are just if you go and you test a non-organic bread product, like even the 365 Whole Foods non-organic wheat bread, it had really, really high levels when it was tested. Another thing actually that is surprising, it's not a grain or a chickpea, is orange juice can come back really high because glyphosate is used a lot in orchards. And it's sprayed and it's this very sandy type of soil that's around and really highly absorbent to whatever it is. And it's picked up, it's brought through the tree and then into the oranges and then into the orange juice. Same thing for almonds. I just actually went to a regenerative field day last week. It's so beautiful. It was during a blossoming season of almonds and California almonds. And it's one farm that is trying to help all the neighboring farms in the Central Valley of California to understand that they don't have to keep on using all these fungicides and pesticides. And this was another one of those experiences where like there are tons of farmers that have just only been using pesticides. The pesticides are actually bankrupting them. Fungicides are super expensive. And they're like, we need to find another financial way. And they don't like using chemicals. And so they were learning about that. And the project I hoping to work on with them is just exposing that level of glyphosate from a regenerative organic farm versus non, because it's the same thing. You spray in between, you spray all the area around the tree. And of course it's picked up into the tree. So that's another area to think of. So buy organic nuts. That's another big one.
Why? I know that you had gone to the Common Ground premiere and are familiar with Gabe Brown and Alan Williams and the Regenerative certification. So why is that important, Kelly? Why is it important that consumers are aware of regenerative farming practices, and why is that so important?
Oh, and it is so important. And right now is a really good time for people to understand what regenerative is, because the large chemical companies are rapidly coming in and trying to greenwash what regenerative means, because they see that there is a trend and people are talking about regenerative and they will say, well, that's great. We have perfect tools for a regenerative situation. Okay. Like there is no regeneration when you are bringing in synthetic chemicals to kill things. So basically what regenerative farming incorporates cover crops, it incorporates livestock, it incorporates no-till. There are just a bunch of practices just going back really to the basics of what it how people have farmed really from the beginning of time, and before this green revolution that brought chemicals into our lives. And from what we know about tilling, like during the Dust Bowl, not over tilling because it breaks up the microbial life that is inside of the soil that's so vital in the topsoil. So it's about restoring that soil health, getting those organisms in there, getting those minerals that we were talking about are now missing back into the soil so that the whole beautiful operation can work again. And it'll call back the beneficial insects that will kill the predators. And I mean, it's just such a beautiful ecosystem when it's working. And there's an argument right now in California because they're trying to put together what a definition is of regenerative agriculture. And for me, I tend to side on, even though I've built like my whole, last 10 years have been spent around pesticides and glyphosate, I very much understand Regenified and Gabe Brown's approach to regenerative agriculture. And there are some people that will say it has to be organic. There are other people that say to be organic, it has to be to be regenerative, it has to be organic. There are other people that say no one will ever get on board if you're saying tomorrow we have to give up everything. And I think that's where Gabe Brown has put together this plan where it can be over time. So if you want to try one field at that time, you try that field and see how it goes. And it's more gradual. It's less scary to take on those steps because I feel for the farmer. I mean, if that's the way you've always farmed, your dad farmed that way, that is scary because it's your livelihood. None of the rest of us are taking any risk for it, but they are. But of course, the financial upside to making that change will be so great. And that is the hope.
The financial aspect is massive. And so, we visit with a lot of farmers on here. I just had one earlier, Kit Pharaoh, and, talking about the input costs. That's what's killing people. In the cattle business, it's the feeding hay over winter. It's the inputs are what are absolutely killing the profitability of ranchers and a lot of the farmers. So the I can't sing that the Understanding Ag and the Regenerified groups praises enough. There's a lot of incredible people that are there as the resource to help guide through that process. I think it's just on all of us to create that awareness about, hey, these are really these ails of society is based off of lifestyle choices, and that
Yeah.
includes diet and the way we produce our food. So, what you're doing is so important.
Oh, thank you. And I work a lot with different CPG, so consumer packaged goods. There are some really wonderful entrepreneurs out there that are trying to put together products that are regenerative. And it's very hard for these small companies to get investors, like private equity investors, to come and back them because any kind of product is risky to take on. And then you add this extra layer of difficulty in sourcing regenerative materials. Like it's a different sourcing market. And so it's a huge challenge for these entrepreneurs. So I always say, any chance I get, if you see someone that's trying to do the right thing, like, why not support them, right? Like, I'm a huge fan of Quinn's pretzels, for example. Like, I love them. I have them every single day, and I'm happy to support them because they're so regenerative. Same with like Lumberg's rice, I believe, is regenerative. And I see that and I'm like, this is fantastic. But be sure to look and see that it's some kind of certified, because someone could put regenerative on the side of the package and it isn't at all.
Yeah. No, the greenwashing
That's going to
is
be a
something
problem.
we've talked about with Gabe, numerous times, and it's a huge problem. And I don't know if Will Harris, but Will get fighting mad over the greenwashing. He has white oak pastures, and so he's just a Southern Georgia guy that he says what he's thinking, and I love that. But Kelly, how do we
It's so weird. I've only heard him speak. He's in the universe. I've never met him. Oh, go ahead.
He's incredible. He's just as good of a guy as there is. That is, that's another thing about this, for lack of a better term, movement that I feel like we're in. It's like the people are incredible. Like, these are genuinely amazing people that are trying to better themselves, their families, their neighbors, their communities. And I just have hope after I get off of these calls and have these conversations that the future is bright. We have a lot of obstacles. We got, it's a David and Goliath type of story, but we know how that one worked out. So I think that there's a lot of hope for us as long as we just keep putting in that work.
Oh my gosh, I'm so with you. I have never, ever been happier with my group of colleagues in my entire life. as I have been in this regenerative agriculture movement. It is just solid people that are doing, they could do other things. Everyone's really talented, and they're here because this is the answer. And it's just so exciting to see. I'm so with you.
Love it.
I'm,
All right,
I'm
Kelly.
happy to connect with you as a team member.
We got there's a lot of us, and that's reciprocated. Where do we send people to find out more about your work and what you're doing, and then tell us what's next for you and the Glyphosate Girl platform?
Yeah, so you can find me. I'm on Instagram as Glyphosate Girl, and then I have a website as well as a resource. It's an educational platform called glyphosatefacts.com, and I've spent a lot of time there. It's really good for the person that is aware maybe that there's a problem, but even if they are not, then it starts from the basics. It's very simple, quick read to understand what the problem is. And then if you dig a little deeper, there is tons of published research for people to refer to about the health effects, so that when people tell you that isn't actually a problem, which happens to me all the time, like you're overblowing the problem, you can be like, I don't think so. Look at this research that's there for that reason. So now what I am working on is I want to continue expanding the educational platform, giving people more materials that they can take to wherever they need to, whether it is a school or to their city or just academic communities, to start spreading this word. And I also have been focusing a little bit more on policy, because it occurred to me after the Congressional Briefing in October that we have people that are there in DC from the Soybean Association, Corn Growers Association, Crop Life, Bayer, like every single day going to these Congress people and senators' offices. From our side, we maybe have like 3 visits a year, and that just can't be, because our voice is being drowned out, and we can't expect all of our representatives to even understand what the problem is. So that is hopefully next.
I love it. Well, cannot wait to send people your way. Continue to follow along and learn, and thank you for what you do, because sometimes when we stand up and we have a something to say, it creates a target, and there's a lot of negative that goes with that too. So just thank you for what you do.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us on Sowing Prosperity. Be sure to follow along across the social media platforms, including YouTube, and be sure to go to sowingprosperity.com.